Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
This conversation is called The Stilled Storm. None of us like to be in the middle of a storm, but The Stilled Storm sounds intriguing. What are the circumstances, Mike?
We're going to be looking at a story today that's recorded in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke. So obviously it made a big impact on all 3 writers, of how Jesus is in a boat one day, and when a storm comes up and he surprises them with how he handles this.
So this is what, on the Sea of Galilee?
Yep, we're on the Sea of Galilee, and we're going to sort of focus the story around the version that's in Matthew chapter 8. In Matthew 8 and 9, Jesus gathers together 9 of Jesus's miracles, groups them in 3s with a little teaching in between each. And the setting for this story is that he's been teaching and healing in Capernaum, which is on the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee. And he gets into a boat to cross over to the other side. Boats, of course, were one of the most convenient ways of crossing the sea to save making the long journey around the edge of it.
I think you've been to the Sea of Galilee, so for anybody who hasn't been, just sort of picture the scene for us. Is it anything like, I don't know, the Lake District?
Well, do you know what? In some ways it is. The Sea of Galilee is harp-shaped. Actually, its Hebrew name in the Old Testament is the Sea of Kinnereth, and Kinnereth is a harp. And it looks like one of these, classic big harps that people play in orchestras. So that's its shape. And it's surrounded by hills on all sides, but cut into these hills are some very steep, narrow passes, which allow the winds to blow down quite suddenly, which is exactly what will happen in this story. We read that a storm suddenly comes up while Jesus and his disciples are out in a boat crossing over from Capernaum to the other side. And this storm suddenly comes up as the wind whips down some of these narrow passes. It actually happened to me once a few years ago when I was on the Sea of Galilee and we were right out in the middle, and suddenly in the distance, actually it was in the northeast of where we were, the sky started to look black, and suddenly the captain of our boat said, "Storm coming," and without any further hesitation immediately changed course to go back to land. We didn't make it. We got caught up in that storm. And believe me, it happened exactly like this story said. Within literally 3 or 4 minutes of him saying, "Storm coming," we were caught up with heavy winds, heavy rain, and the sea completely tossing and turning.
Presumably it takes longer to walk around the Sea of Galilee than to travel across by boat. So there would be a practical reason why people would travel backwards and forwards. And on this occasion, you say Jesus has been teaching the people, teaching the crowds, and needs to get from A to B.
Yes, and not only does he need to get from A to B, he's utterly exhausted. We've noted in previous episodes how the Gospels really underline the genuine humanity of Jesus. He was indeed the Son of God come into this world, but he was the Son of God become a full, complete, real human being, not a sort of Clark Kent Superman figure who could rip off his shirt at any moment and reveal underneath who he really was. This was the Son of God become a human being. And as such, well, we find references to him being hungry and thirsty and tired. And clearly, after a whole stint of teaching and doing his miracles, the guy is exhausted.
So Jesus is absolutely exhausted, but he still needs to travel to the other side of the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah, the start of our story begins with the words, "Then he got into the boat and the disciples followed him." And then we read, without warning, a furious storm came up on the lake. Like I just said, in my experience, without warning, suddenly there in minutes, so that the waves swept over the boat. Now, how do I know that Jesus was exhausted? Because of what we go on to read. But Jesus was sleeping. In fact, there's a lovely little detail in Mark's gospel. Mark was the account based on Peter's eyewitness account, who was obviously one of the 12. And Mark, in his account there, says he was asleep in the stern of the boat on a cushion. I mean, why would you include that? Unless you'd been there and it was graphic. And you know, when graphic things happen, little things stick in your mind and you think, Jesus, there's this storm coming up. But what is he doing? He's asleep on a cushion in the stern of the boat. Why? He's completely shafted after his day of ministry. Here is the one who created the whole of the world, who is completely at peace. You know, he's not thrown by the fact that there is a storm coming up. In his heart, in his spirit, he's completely at peace. These are just the things that he has made. You know, I've known people who've slept through all things. I was once in Uganda just the year after the civil war ended there, when I was sharing a room with a fellow pastor who managed to sleep through a gun battle with rifles and machine guns going off outside of our window. And he slept through it. And there was me terrified about the whole thing, really. But he was completely at peace. He was zonked. But this is more than that. This is more than Jesus was so shattered he was zonked. This is in his heart and spirit. He is totally at peace. You know, why do I say that? Well, because of how the story unfolds. The disciples do what one might expect them to do. They go over and wake Jesus, you know, shake him up and say, Lord, save us. We're going to drown. Actually, in Mark's gospel, and by the way, where we get the same story in different gospels, it's good to compare them, because each one of them sometimes just records a little emphasis, an angle, a memory that the other one doesn't. In Mark's gospel, it's even stronger than that. They say, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Wow. That is, I mean, like, that's big stuff, isn't it? But I think all of that reflects this sense of panic. This storm was really so bad, they're in a complete panic. Now, remember, some of these followers of Jesus have been professional fishermen on this lake. This was not the first time they'd experienced a storm on that lake. They would have had many in their lifetimes, but clearly this storm was of a nature that they hadn't experienced before, and they're thrown into complete panic.
It's almost as if in this mother of all storms, their reaction is exactly the opposite to Jesus's.
It is, isn't it? He's at peace, he's at rest, he's just sleeping. They're completely thrown into panic. Though it's interesting, they wake him. Why? Because deep down they must have known that he could have done something about this. I think they've been with him long enough now to know that Jesus can deal with this storm. By the way, he always can. Whatever storms we might be facing in life at the moment, Jesus not only knows about them, but can help us in them no matter how bad they get.
So this isn't them waking him up to tell him that there's a storm going on and he hasn't noticed?
No, I think he was well aware of what was going on. Because, you know, if the first surprise in the story is that Jesus manages to sleep through it while everyone's panicking, the second surprise in the story for me is that Jesus then rebukes them. And he rebukes them, you know, not for, why did you disturb my sleep? It's not that sort of rebuke. He rebukes them and says, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? So, he's not even rubbing his eyes and saying, what's going on? Oh, there's a storm, is there? His first words to them, a rebuke. So deep in his spirit, he was at peace, he was at rest, he knew what was going on. So, you have little faith. Why are you afraid? In fact, in Mark, the rebuke comes after he's dealt with the situation. Why were you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And I think there's the secret. That's why he rebukes them. There is an utter lack of faith here in this story, an utter lack of belief that, come on, guys, have I not been with you long enough now for you to know that I can deal with this situation? And perhaps just in passing, that can be a challenge to us today, particularly those of us who've walked with Jesus for a good number of years now, and maybe we're facing particular situations and have got in a panic, and maybe Jesus would want to say to us, come on, have you not been with me long enough now to know that I can deal with this? Bring it to me.
So even today, people who call themselves Christians can potentially say they've seen enough not to have to doubt.
I think we all have our moments, don't we, if we're honest, no matter how good and strong a Christian we are. And probably the number of people who never, ever have a doubt or a fear is small indeed. But I think out of this story, what we can draw is, okay, you've had your moment of doubt and panic and dread, but come on now, take a hold. Have you not seen me work before? So for me and my wife, recently we had to face the dread panic of our daughter in her mid-30s having not just one breast cancer, but 2 different types of breast cancer consecutively in the same breast. And the truth is, when something like that comes, it hits you like a sledgehammer. And for those first few moments or hours, we were like hitting all over the place. And, your emotions, you don't know what to do with them. But I can honestly, genuinely say, I got down and had to say, okay, Lord, this feels like a terrible storm in a sea. But I just want to take hold of myself now, take hold of my emotions and my fears, and to say, I've walked with you long enough to know that you are going to do something through this. And I think that's the encouragement I would give to people today, not to put them down and say, if you're a real believer, you will never have a moment of doubt. You'll always be strong and say, yes, I know the Lord is going to work here. But I think to be able to get off your chest all your panic and your fear, but then come on, go back. What have you seen God do before? What have you heard God promise before? Come on, gather all that and get your feet on a rock. And for me, in my challenging times, the rock is always to get a scripture that I can stand on. And 99 times out of 100, those scriptures for me will always come out of my regular daily routine. It will just happen to be there on that day that I need it. And it's like I get my feet on a rock and think, that's my verse, that's my promise. I've known enough from you in the past, Lord, to trust you here.
Is there a sense with what Jesus was saying to the disciples that he believed in them? He wanted them to rise up in faith?
Yes, I think so. And, just those very words, you have little faith, why are you afraid? Maybe he even expected them. Do you know what? You could have dealt with this yourself. And you could have left me sleeping because I'm shattered. So there is this expectation that either they would have dealt with it, and clearly there are times when in the Gospels he will rebuke them for not being able to deal with things like the young epileptic boy who's brought to them and they don't deal with it. And he said, you could have done this yourself, really. So there is this expectation either that they would have dealt with it or that at least you would have trusted that I could after all that you have seen.
After Jesus had spoken to the disciples in the way that he did, what did he then do?
That's where the next surprise comes in the story, because he speaks now not to the disciples, but he speaks to the storm. So Matthew records it like this in chapter 8, verse 26. He replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. He rebuked the wind and the waves. Now, I love the translation here that Tom Wright has in his Kingdom New Testament translation, because it brings home so strongly the meaning of that word rebuke, which can sound a bit religious at times, can't it? He translates this as he told the wind and waves to behave themselves. And when I read that again recently, I thought, oh, wow, that is so powerful. Behave yourselves. Imagine him saying that. Actually, in Greek, the word that's used here for rebuked is the same word that's used when Jesus rebukes demons in the gospel. So it looks almost like we're meant to see here there was some demonic influence, some sort of demonic attack going on through something very ordinary, very humans. Demons rarely appear, with horns and pitchforks and things like that. The devil uses his servants very often through the circumstances of life. And so he rebukes the demonic activity that was trying to use God's own creation against him and tells them to behave themselves.
Because on face value, Jesus and the disciples could have been wiped out. They could have been drowned.
Absolutely. This is a furious storm. Remember, even the guys who've been fishermen in their past lives are troubled, frightened, terrified by this storm. So this really could have been a life changer, life loser. But in contrast, what a contrast here, the contrast of their fear and panic with Jesus telling the wind and the waves to behave themselves. Actually, Mark's gospel has another angle on it. Again, this is why it's so good to compare the different stories at times. There it says, he got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And the wind died down and it was calm. And the word there that he chooses in his gospel to write, quiet, is actually the word that was used for muzzling a dog. It's as if he's addressing the wind and the waves and saying to them, be muzzled, be contained. You are not going to do the destroying work that you want it to do. Again, suggesting perhaps something demonic behind this particular incident of a storm here.
Because I've heard of talking to trees, but talking to a storm, it does sound ridiculous.
It does, doesn't it? It sounds crazy. But what's going on here? This is the creator of the universe speaking to his creation. The Bible's very clear that everything was brought into being through Jesus. Jesus, the Son of God, the one who was with his Father and the Holy Spirit from the very beginning. The New Testament tells us that all things were created through him. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. John says in the introduction to his gospel. Paul's very clear in his writings that Jesus was the agent of creation, the one God used to bring it about. So here's the one who brought about creation, simply calling creation back to do what it was meant to do. Of course, creation had got spoiled. One of the things we see right back at the beginning of the story in Genesis is that when sin comes into the world, sin comes not just into people, sin comes into the very fabric of creation itself. Paul uses the words about creation creaking and groaning under the weight of sin. We live in an age when more than ever, we can see the results of human sin impacting the world. Now, non-Christians may not call it sin, but they can certainly see it as human stupidity, human choices, human wrong choices that are impacting on our creation that causes forests to catch fire in a way they've never have done before, and floods to come in a way that they never have before, and ice caps to melt in ways they never have before. Why? Because of our action, we would say, sinful behavior in this world. But here's the one who made all that, who finds no difficulty at all in bringing it all back into line. As, of course, one day he will do fully and completely, as we see in the book of Revelation.
So these experienced fishermen in this boat, their life had been on the line, and now suddenly the storm's stopped, it's quiet, and in the stillness, no doubt they're reflecting on what has just happened.
You know, that moment, David, must have been pretty incredible, didn't it? Because they said instantly the storm stopped. So you're instantly moved from this wild, frenetic wind and waves. And, you know, if ever you have been caught in a storm, it really can be quite terrifying. I was glad to be back on land when I was caught in that storm on the Sea of Galilee. I've been caught in a storm on another inland lake in Europe when sailing once. And it is frightening. You know, I understand how they felt when they said, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. And that thought that you may drown is incredible. And suddenly you've gone from all of that to utter stillness. And what on earth must have been racing through their minds at that moment? Well, the Gospels tell us. Matthew 8:27 says that men were amazed and asked, what kind of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Mark says they were terrified. They're terrified for a different reason. Terrified not because of the storm, but because of the implications of what had just happened here. They were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. And of course, they would gradually and increasingly come to the answer that there can only be one person who this is. The one who controlled the wind and the waves is the one who made the winds and the waves, and who therefore has the power and the right to control them.
I'm just looking at the stories in Matthew's Gospel and Mark's Gospel, and I think it's just a few verses, 4 verses in Matthew's account and just 6 verses in Mark's account. It's a tiny little part of the whole New Testament, and yet here in this account is a turning point for the disciples.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, isn't it? Because they could have made so much more of this. You know, I think if I were writing my life biography and, you know, I'd experienced that, I'd probably milk it, you know, for every bit I could get out of it. And yet so compact. Of course, many of the stories in the Gospels are so compact. This is not the age when we can write endlessly, you know, on our social media account and nobody's counting how many pages. These are the days of scrolls and when it was expensive to write. So you were fairly concise in the telling of your story. And as I said, in Matthew's case, he's bunched together 3 groups of 3 miracles. He's going bang, 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 implication, bang, bang, bang. And so this is just one of a whole number of stories meant to point towards a growing understanding of who this man Jesus was.
And how important is it for any of us to ask those same questions today?
Oh, I think it's one of the most important questions in life. You know, what kind of man is this? Who is this? What sort of man is it that can do the sort of things and teach the sort of things that Jesus does in the Gospels? And, you know, let me just say, if some of our listeners, if it's a long time since you ever read some of the stories of Jesus, then why not decide even today that you're going to do that? Some of us who are a bit older will have remembered stories of Jesus from times we were taught it in what used to be called religious education or religious instruction at school. Some of us will remember it from Sunday school classes. But of course, a growing number of people today have not had that sort of teaching in their state schools. They will not have been sent to Sunday school as I was when I was younger. And so these stories are not part of the fabric of your life. And I want to encourage you to go and read these stories for yourself. Read Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Get hold of a Bible. Actually, you don't even have to go and buy one. You can access them online for free these days. And read these stories of Jesus. But as you read them, just sort of read a small chunk at a time and maybe ask yourself that question. What kind of man is this? What sort of person could do this? Remember, these are not made up stories. These are well authenticated stories. Luke starts his gospel by telling us that he carefully researched and interviewed people. He'd been a good investigative journalist before he wrote his stories. So read these stories for yourself. And as you read them, ask, what kind of man is this? Who is it who could have taught this, done this? And I think the answer you will come to will be that which the New Testament leads us to. No human being could do this. No mere prophet, no mere holy man could do this. This is what happens when the Son of God comes into this world. These are the sort of things that can happen. These are the sort of changes that can happen when you will let this man into your life today.
I think one of the things that surprises me is that these disciples have been with Jesus for some time, actually in his presence, seen him performing miracles, heard him teach, travelled around somewhat. And it's not until this point that they're asking these questions.
Yeah, I wonder what was going on. I always think we've got to be careful not to read into Scripture what we are not told. So we don't know always what the, if you like, psychological mechanisms were going on. But I think it's a case of evidence building up. Now, there's no doubt that the disciples at the beginning of the Gospels, Jesus calls them, and whether it's at that moment or they've heard some stuff before that we're not told about, that they then decide to follow. But I think this is what authenticate the Gospels. None of them starts with, Jesus called his disciples, and at that moment they knew instantly that this man was the Son of God who come into this world to die to save them. No, there is a growing journey with Jesus. And little by little by little, they're starting to see more. And it's like, at first, I'm sure they think, wow, this is great. This is a miracle worker. Wow, this is a bit more than a miracle worker, isn't it? Wow, this seems to be a messianic miracle worker. Wow, this seems to be God himself who's come into the world to be the messianic miracle worker. And we do get this journey, and it's not a straight line of growth in their understanding. There are points where they get it. There'll be a point where when Jesus will ask his disciples, who are people saying that I am? And they'll say, well, some say John the Baptist and some say Elijah come back from the dead. And he'll say to them, yeah, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? Most important question any of us ever have to answer. And at that point, Peter says, you're the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And at that moment, he's got it. And only moments later, Jesus has to rebuke him for his lack of understanding about the sort of Messiah he will be. So this is, if you can imagine it on a chart, this is a chart that's zigzagging up and down like a patient who's got a temperature that's fluctuating greatly. But the line's going upwards. Never do they start with, I've got it all. And that, for me, is what authenticates the Gospels so much. This is the account of Jesus revealing himself and his followers getting it bit by bit by bit until eventually the penny drops. And he still invites people to do that with him today.
I was going to say, that gives us hope even now that we don't have to have it all together. It may take time.
Absolutely. Not only may it take time, I can guarantee and prophesy it will take time. I do love the picture of a journey. It is a journey with Jesus, just as it was for these disciples. It's listening to his teaching, giving it a go. Go on, try it out, see that it will work. Got it wrong? Never mind. Get forgiveness. Come on, try again. It's about stepping out with Jesus and Yes, expecting him still to do miracles at times when we call out to him. So it is a journey. It's learning how to align ourselves with him more and more, learning how to tell the wind and waves that impact our lives, behave yourselves in his name, and finding increasingly that they do so, but not getting discouraged when we have a failure any more than the disciples needed to get discouraged. Why? Because we're on a journey, and it's a journey that is so exciting and that always has more to reveal to us, no matter how long we've walked with Jesus.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.